We've had a great sort of confluence here of discussion of technical and policy and law. And to lawyers, okay, so obviously I'm a lawyer. I'm with the American Bar Association. One of my recent former jobs, I was the general counsel for the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. And it's where I became interested in the space law area and realizing this is such an emerging area, but very few people know about it. It's a real niche of lawyers, I'm finding out, that really do this in depth, and we're going to hear from two of them here in a minute. But we need to make more people aware of this, and it has such an overlap with other areas of national security law as well. So this is part of our education and getting that word out. To lawyers, facts. We're discussing a lot of the facts today. Lawyers can't really help with drafting law or understanding what is needed in the law unless you understand the venue or the context in which you're doing it. And so some of the technical points that we have made today actually are what we would call facts, right? And then you have to sort of apply a lot of the facts. So this is a great discussion on bringing all those ideas together. But law, unfortunately, always lags behind technology. It's always the frustration we have in many fields. So there is a group of lawyers, and you're going to hear from two of them today. Rengati is here as well, who's part of this group. They're actually trying to look ahead. What is our existing law, and how it can be applied to space, and trying to think through that before we're at a critical decision point and have to make a quick decision. So I applaud them for looking ahead. So you've already heard from both of them. We have Melissa Zwart, the Dean of the Adelaide Law School, and we have Jack Beard at the Nebraska School of Law, who actually specializes also in space law. And they're going to tell you probably a little bit about the Romero Manual and project, as well as some other issues. So I hand it over to them.
Thanks so much. I am going to start just by giving a very brief overview of essentially the context to the legal side of the discussion. So one of the things that I always point out to people, and it is probably very obvious to everybody in this room, is the fact that the development of space technology started with military technology. So military uses, military technology is at the heart of space technology. And it's been noted by commentators like Vlasic that the launch of Sputnik in 1957 evidenced not a triumph for world science, but rather a demonstration of a revolutionary military instrument with potentially awesome strategic consequences. But from that we went on to develop the range of outer space treaties, and they were formulated very much in the context of there being essentially two spacefaring nations at that time, obviously the US and the USSR. And there was a lot of language that was used in the lead up to those treaties, which is still incredibly relevant to us today. So even though we talk about the development, of technology and the need to look ahead at what we're doing, we also have to do a lot of dealing with the legacies of the past, and the outer space treaties, I think, are particularly a very strong hand on any steps forward that we are trying to make at the moment. So we have the outer space treaties. We have, in particular, the outer space treaty itself. And Article 1 sets out very aspirational principles that the exploration and use of outer space shall be carried out for the benefit and the interests of all countries, irrespective of their degree of economic or scientific development, and shall be the province of all mankind. Obviously, women have no role to play in space. Or maybe just the laws don't apply to us and we can do what we like.
It's another emerging area.
Article 3, of course, articulates other principles that talk about the need to carry on activities in the exploration and use of outer space in accordance with international law. Including the Charter of the United Nations. So one of the things that we need to deal with in the Woomera Manual is what the relationship between the Outerspace Treaties in their specific sense and general principles of international law, how they interrelate. And of course, one of the major issues that arises is in terms of military uses of outer space. And the peaceful purposes principle, which is often touted as putting forward a very simplistic notion of the fact that you can't have any military uses of outer space. But as I said at the beginning, military uses are there right at the very beginning. I should also note in passing, because this becomes relevant when we talk about soft law instruments, that the address of then President Eisenhower to the UN General Assembly in 1960 outlined many of the principles that were adopted in the Outer Space Treaty, including the fact that they're not subject to national appropriation, the agreement that nations should not engage in warlike activities on these bodies, and the need to press forward with a program of international cooperation under the United Nations, which was done. But point 3, which was not picked up in the later treaties, was the agreement that weapons of mass destruction shall not be put into orbit or in station in outer space, but that principle was subject to appropriate verification, and the verification principle didn't make it into the final treaty agreement. So it also is there in the beginnings of it. So for those of you who are Bond aficionados, I'm sure you think fondly of the scene from the 1967 Bond movie You Only Live Twice, where there is a very fiendish plan of Spectre which involves an unmarked space object which looks very much like I don't even know what to describe, which comes up into space and captures firstly the American satellite and then the Russian satellite.
Clearly Chinese.
Spectre, right?
Or Australian.
Which involves a very, very fascinating international dispute between the Russians and the Americans, which then results in it being arbitrated by none other than the British. And I don't think we'd be going to them to arbitrate any dispute anytime soon. So I would just conclude by saying that these principles, as important as they are now being stretched to their ultimate limit. We have very rapid advances, as we've already discussed today, in commercial space, but we also have to face the fact that these very rapid advances are occurring in countries other than the US and Russia, the original parties to or initiators of the agreement. So just from an article in Space News yesterday, it was noted that China had 39 satellite launches in 2018. The US, by comparison, had 31. Russia had 20 and Europe had 8. So there's a significant need for, I think, what has been described as a new look at responsive space development and the need to focus on innovation in the procurement and development of innovative commercial services. So, in other words, it is becoming difficult for the US and, by consequence, its very reliant allies, such as Australia, to rely only on technological advantage. So I will leave it there because Jack is going to pick up on some issues to do with what has happened sort of since the space treaties and the reliance now on soft law instruments.
Yes, and I'm timing myself because I've got 5 minutes. There's precious little in the Outer Space Treaty about weapons and precious little restricting military activities. And that's because it was designed that way by 2 blocks of powerful states, much to the anger, disappointment, chagrin of the Indians and Brazilians. And the arguments you hear today about peaceful purposes go back, if you read it, to their initial arguments. And the result of their arguments was disaster. The peaceful purposes, as it applies to outer space, was relegated to the preamble, which, if you work with the Russians, like I did most of my life, means you've lost. Okay, it isn't. There is no restriction on outer space activities in this area, and with respect to military activities. And of course, we know weapons of mass destruction have their limits, but I view that as under threat by NASA in their latest planetary defense efforts, because I don't view that as a positive development. Anyway, that's where we begin. There have been no treaties since 1979, and so that has resulted in a plethora of something called soft law. Academics love soft law. It justifies their trip to Geneva over and over again. And then they write things, and they must be important because they've gone to Geneva so many times. Okay? And I make them all mad when I speak, but there are some soft law, it's not really law, but soft law things that, as I recount in my articles, have gone on to contribute to larger, useful, binding things. And then there's the other 99%, which I categorize as hopes, wishes, prayers, dreams, and are useless to me as a lawyer. Now, when people start talking about TCBMs, confidence building measures, declarations, statements, UN General Assembly resolutions, some of these have been important in space law, but I have to say that there's as many disadvantages of using these as there are advantages, and not including the Chinese and Russians, not having binding terms, not giving you definitions. You can't monitor cheating if you don't define it. So there's many problems with that. Some of you may like soft law, and we'll be experiencing that discussion together. Please distinguish these efforts to make rules of the road that could restrict U.S. military activities and codes of conduct, which have gone down in flames as well. Please distinguish those in what we're trying to do in WUMRA with respect to just the law of armed conflict and the use of force. We are doing what international law dictates we do, and that's looking and relying on state practice. State practice is at the foundation of interpreting international agreements in the Vienna Convention law of treaties. It's fundamental to finding whether or not there's customary international law. If you want to talk to me about your view of some of these things, I'd like you to tell me what states have done and what they haven't done when they have the opportunity to assert these rights and they don't. We could have a long discussion with the lawyers here about the significance of silence when it comes to these things. But that's an interesting episode, but there's so many rules that are not being applied by the major powers that they have to be mentioned as well. WUMRA is about state practice. WUMRA is about what the existing rules are. WUMRA is about an attempt to apply those to space with no focus on what it should be, what it ought to be, or what Professor Pufendorf believes so strongly in his heart must be there because he's written so much about it. I'm sorry, Professor Pufendorf is a fictional character my students all know and love. He's an ass. Okay. Okay. So. Oh, this is being recorded. Hi, everyone. I'm only here for a few more minutes.
We're destroying the tape. So.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah, don't circulate it. No copies.
Jack, the goal is to keep you promotable, but keep on rolling.
So, as I look at our remaining things to talk about here, I sense another thing that some lawyers like me have a bit of an allergy to, and that's a whole bunch of arguing by analogy and turning around to yo-ho-ho, the law of sea treaty. And now the lonely law of sea people, apologies to those of us, would love to find all these analogies and precedents and so forth. Space is different, and we could talk about that as well. That's been the subject of other panels and conferences and so forth. But I give you one last rule that I find really different about space, and that hasn't really been explored yet, but will be really important to the United States of America. And that's Article 6 of the Outerspace Treaty that makes the United States of America responsible for the national activities out in space. If that was something that ended up in there because the Russians did not like American companies wandering around in space, the compromise was this provision. There's a really, when I've spoken to generals who are working in this area of space, and the retired ones especially can speak more freely, there's a growing concern that military forces, the United States in particular, might be called upon to be going and protecting and doing things for U.S. nationals as they find resources in space, which is very close to a mining stage. And you have really large questions about these exclusionary zones and these other things. As Dave Koplow was mentioning, we're very comfortable with this. That's going to be more of a problem in the future because, as also noted, wherever humans have gone, dirt, water, air, and something like gold or platinum or water is discovered, conflict ensues and states inevitably end up wanting to protect what they've got. We have an odd situation in Article 6 because unlike registered vehicles, registered aircraft, registered ships, this is more responsibility than we're used to in any other setting. So there's questions about amending agreements, doing new agreements. That's our dual overview of the whole thing. So have at it. Enjoy. That's it.